The train whistle echoed across the Kansas prairie like a mourning cry, and Clara Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the cold window glass, watching Willowbrook emerge from the endless wheat fields like a mirage of hope and doubt. She wore black from head to toe, not by choice of fashion, but by necessity of grief, and in her carpetbag sat a single letter that had promised her a new life with a man who'd never seen her face. What neither she nor the townspeople waiting at that station could know was that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most shocking rejections, and that in a place where death was part of daily life, one man would see past the shadows to find the light beneath. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1887, and Willowbrook, Kansas stretched across the prairie like a determined prayer carved into the grassland. It wasn't the largest town or the most prosperous, but it sat at the crossroads of two railroad lines, which meant it had something most prairie settlements lacked: a steady stream of strangers passing through, and with them, the endless possibility of change. The main street ran straight as a funeral procession from the depot to the white-steepled church, lined with wooden storefronts that had weathered enough storms to earn their place in the landscape. Miller's Creek wound through the town's heart, its waters reflecting the endless sky above, and carrying the whispered hopes of those who'd come seeking something better than what they'd left behind. The townspeople of Willowbrook were prairie stock, shaped by harsh winters and blazing summers, their faces lined with the kind of honesty that came from working land that gave grudgingly and only to those who earned it. They were quick to help in times of trouble, quicker still to notice when someone didn't quite fit the mold they'd carved from years of shared struggle and mutual dependence. The church bells marked their days, the train whistle punctuated their weeks, and the turning of seasons measured their lives in ways that city folk would never understand. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where reputation traveled faster than gossip, and where first impressions carried the weight of permanence. Maggie Henley had been Willowbrook's unofficial matchmaker for going on 12 years, ever since she'd taken over the post office from her late husband, and discovered that love letters were far more interesting than bills and business correspondence. She had a gift for reading between the lines, for seeing past the careful words people chose when their hearts were on the line, and for knowing which lonely souls in town might find happiness together if given the right gentle push. Her small office behind the post office counter had become the town's unofficial marriage bureau, where bachelors came seeking advice and spinsters lingered, hoping for news of potential suitors traveling through on the railroad. The wheat fields surrounding Willowbrook rolled away to every horizon, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or windmill, their golden waves rippling in the constant prairie wind like a vast ocean of grain. It was beautiful in its own austere way, but it was also isolating. And the isolation had a way of making people either stronger or stranger, depending on their constitution. The town cemetery sat on a small rise called Maple Hill, its headstones standing like patient sentinels over the final resting places of those who'd tried to tame this land and had instead been claimed by it. The maple trees that gave the hill its name had been planted by the town's founders, and now they provided the only real shade for miles around. Their leaves change in color each fall like a reminder that even in this harsh place, beauty could find a way to flourish. Dr. James Walsh had been the town's physician for 8 years, and in that time he'd delivered more babies than he'd lost patients, which he considered a remarkable achievement given the unforgiving nature of prairie life. His office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on Main Street, with living quarters above and a small surgical room in the back, where he'd performed everything from setting broken bones to removing bullets from Saturday night altercations. He was a practical man who believed in the healing power of fresh air, hard work, and the kind of community support that Willowbrook provided in abundance. But he also understood that some wounds went deeper than medicine could reach. Samuel Fletcher owned the largest general store in town and had his fingers in more business ventures than anyone else in 3 counties. His wife Sarah had come from money back in Missouri, and together they built what passed for high society. In Willowbrook, hosting dinner parties and church socials that set the social tone for the entire community. Samuel was the kind of man who measured success in dollars and social standing, who believed that appearance mattered almost as much as character, and who had definite opinions about what kind of people belonged in his town and what kind didn't. His imposing 2-story house with its wraparound porch and carefully tended garden stood as a monument to his prosperity and his expectations. The railroad depot sat at the east end of Main Street like a gateway between the known and unknown, its weathered platform witnessing more arrivals than departures as people continued to seek their fortunes in the expanding West. The depot master, a grizzled veteran named Pete Morrison, had seen every kind of traveler imaginable step off those trains, from traveling salesmen to circuit preachers, from desperate families seeking new starts to mysterious strangers with secrets in their luggage. He'd developed an eye for reading people in the few seconds it took them to step from the train car to the platform, and he prided himself on being able to predict which newcomers would stay and which would catch the next train heading anywhere else. Hartwell's boarding house occupied a prime location 2 blocks from the depot. Its 3 stories, providing temporary accommodations for travelers and more permanent lodging for those who hadn't yet established themselves in the community. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had been running the establishment since her husband's death 5 years earlier, and she'd built a reputation for serving the best meals between Kansas City and Denver, for maintaining the cleanest rooms west of the Mississippi, and for having an uncanny ability to judge character that had kept her establishment free of troublemakers and undesirables. Her boarding house was where newcomers got their first real taste of Willowbrook hospitality, and where they learned the unspoken rules that governed social interaction in a close-knit prairie community. Pastor William Cross had been shepherding the spiritual needs of Willowbrook's residents for nearly a decade, and his Sunday sermons had become as much a part of the town's weekly routine as the Saturday night dances and the Wednesday evening prayer meetings. He was a man who believed in the power of redemption, in the possibility of fresh starts, and in the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to find the divine spark that existed in every human soul. His church stood at the west end of Main Street, its white steeple visible from miles away across the prairie, serving as both a beacon for travelers and a reminder to residents that some things transcended the daily struggles of frontier life. The general store, bank, blacksmith shop, and various other businesses that lined Main Street formed the commercial heart of Willowbrook, each establishment serving not just as a place of business, but as a gathering spot where information was exchanged, relationships were forged, and the social fabric of the community was woven together thread by thread. The owners of these businesses were more than merchants. They were the unofficial mayors, counselors, and confidants who helped newcomers find their place in the intricate web of relationships that made frontier life not just bearable but meaningful. Miller's Creek provided the town's water supply and powered the small mill that ground grain for the surrounding farms, but it also served as a place of quiet reflection where couples walked in the evening, where children played in the summer, and where solitary souls came to think through the decisions that would shape their futures. The creek bed was lined with cottonwoods and willows that provided welcome shade in the brutal summer heat, and the gentle sound of flowing water offered a constant reminder that life found a way to persist even in the harshest environments. The surrounding farmland stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, broken into sections by property lines that existed more in the county records than in any visible boundaries on the endless prairie. The farmers who worked this land were the backbone of Willowbrook's economy, bringing their grain to market, their families to church, and their problems to the various professionals who served their needs. They were people who understood the cycles of planting and harvest, who knew that success came from patience and persistence, and who had learned to find joy in small victories and beauty in the vast simplicity of grassland under an endless sky. The prairie wind was a constant presence in Willowbrook, carrying the scent of grass and grain, the sound of approaching weather, and the dreams of those who'd come seeking something better than what they'd left behind. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was a wind that could be gentle or fierce, comforting or destructive, but it was always there, shaping the landscape and the people who called it home. Those who learned to live with the wind, to bend without breaking, found that they could thrive in this harsh but beautiful place, while those who fought against it soon discovered that the prairie had ways of humbling even the most stubborn souls. This was the Willowbrook that waited for Clara Whitmore as her train approached the depot on that crisp October morning. A town balanced between tradition and possibility, between the security of the known and the promise of the unknown. It was a place where appearances mattered, where first impressions carried lasting weight, and where the color of a woman's dress could determine her fate before she'd spoken a single word. But it was also a place where understanding could bloom. In unexpected hearts, where true beauty could be recognized by those with eyes to see it, and where love could find a way to flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. Clara Whitmore had been wearing black for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days, not because she was in mourning, but because she had learned that grief was something you carried rather than something you recovered from. She had come to understand that loss changed the very fabric of who you were, and that sometimes the most honest thing you could do was dress to match the landscape of your heart. Her black dresses were not a fashion choice or a statement of defiance, but rather a quiet acknowledgement that some experiences marked you so deeply that pretending otherwise felt like a betrayal of everything you had endured. The mirror in her small room at the boarding house in St. Louis had reflected the same image every morning for those 3 years and 4 months. A woman of 24 with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, green eyes that held depths most people never bothered to explore, and a face that might have been considered beautiful if not for the shadow of sadness that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She had grown accustomed to the way people's expressions changed when they noticed her clothing, the way conversations faltered when she entered a room, the way potential suitors found sudden reasons to look elsewhere when introduced to the woman who dressed like a widow despite never having been married. Her story began in a small town in Ohio where she had been born, Clara Elizabeth Morrison, the eldest daughter of a family that had known prosperity until the bank failures of 1884 swept away their savings, their home, and ultimately their hope. Her father had been a respected merchant, her mother a woman of refinement who had taught Clara to read Shakespeare and play piano, to embroider delicate flowers on fine linen, and to conduct herself with the dignity befitting a lady of good breeding. But prosperity, as Clara had learned, was as fragile as morning frost, and when it disappeared, it took with it not just material comfort, but the very identity she had been raised to inhabit. The death of her parents in a carriage accident during the bitter winter of 1884 had left Clara and her younger brother Timothy orphans with nothing but debts and the clothes on their backs. Timothy, barely 16 and already showing signs of the consumption that would claim him 2 years later, had been sent to live with distant relatives in Pennsylvania, who made it clear that one orphan was burden enough. Clara had been left to fend for herself in a world that had little patience for young women without family connections, financial resources, or the cheerful disposition that society expected from those seeking to make their own way. She had tried to maintain appearances at first, taking in sewing and laundry to pay for a tiny room above a bakery, darning her good dresses and carefully mending her gloves so that no one would suspect how far she had fallen. But the work was hard and the pay was small, and gradually her wardrobe had deteriorated until she could no longer pretend to be anything other than what she was, a woman who had lost everything and was struggling to survive. The black dress she wore to Timothy's funeral in 1886 had been borrowed from a neighbor, but when she looked at herself in the mirror that day, she realized that it was the first time in months that her clothing had matched her inner state. After Timothy's death, Clara had made a decision that shocked the few people who still took any interest in her circumstances. Instead of continuing to struggle with the pretense of maintaining respectability while living in poverty, she had chosen to embrace the honesty of her situation. She had sold her remaining possessions, used the money to purchase 3 simple black dresses of good quality, and had begun to live as the woman she had become rather than the woman she had been raised to be. The decision had been liberating in ways she hadn't expected, freeing her from the exhausting effort of pretending that her losses hadn't fundamentally changed her. The black dresses had served her well in the years that followed. They were practical, hiding the stains and wear that came from working in boarding houses and taking in laundry, and they required no decoration or ornamentation that she couldn't afford. They were appropriate for the various jobs she had held, from caring for invalids to helping families prepare their dead for burial, work that other women avoided, but that Clara found meaningful in ways she couldn't fully explain. There was something about being present during life's most difficult moments that felt honest and necessary, and the black dresses had become a kind of uniform for the role she had chosen to play. But the black dresses had also become a barrier between Clara and the kind of life that other women her age were building. Potential suitors saw the somber clothing and assumed she was either already spoken for or too morbid for polite company. Employers sometimes hesitated to hire her, worried that her appearance might disturb their customers or bring bad luck to their businesses. Even other women often kept their distance, as if grief might be contagious or as if her willingness to acknowledge life's darker realities made her somehow unsuitable for ordinary friendships. Clara had learned to move through the world with a quiet dignity that neither sought attention nor avoided it, accepting both the isolation and the freedom that came with her unconventional choices. She had discovered that there was a strange peace in being truly seen by very few people, in having no expectations placed upon her beyond the basic requirements of whatever work she was doing. She had found that loss, while painful, had also stripped away the illusions and pretenses that had once seemed so important, leaving her with a clarity about what mattered and what didn't that most people never achieved. The letter that had brought her to Willowbrook had come through Maggie Henley's matchmaking service, written by a man who claimed to be seeking a wife who understood that life held both joy and sorrow, someone who wouldn't flinch at the realities of frontier existence. The letter had been different from the others she had received over the years, written in a steady hand by someone who seemed to understand that strength came in many forms, and that the most beautiful flowers often grew in the most unlikely soil. He had signed himself simply as Tom, had mentioned that he worked with his hands and lived quietly, and had asked only that she be honest about who she was and what she wanted from life. Clara had written back with the same honesty she had brought to every aspect of her life since Timothy's death. She had explained her circumstances, her losses, and her choice to dress in black as a recognition of life's impermanence and the importance of acknowledging both beauty and sorrow. She had told him about her work caring for the dying and helping families through their grief, about her belief that there was honor in facing life's difficult truths rather than hiding from them. She had asked for nothing more than the chance to be useful and to perhaps find a corner of the world where her particular gifts might be appreciated. His response had been immediate and encouraging. He had written that he understood loss and respected her honesty, that he was not seeking an ornament for his arm, but a partner who could face whatever challenges life might bring. He had sent money for her train ticket and had promised to meet her at the depot in Willowbrook, had assured her that she would find a place in his life and in his community if she was willing to give both a chance. The correspondence had continued for several months, each letter revealing more about both their characters and their hopes for the future. Now as the train carried her across the Kansas prairie toward an uncertain future, Clara found herself thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment. She could have tried to reinvent herself, could have purchased a wardrobe of cheerful colors, and pretended that her losses had not fundamentally changed her. She could have presented herself as the kind of woman that most men expected to find. When they sent for a mail-order bride, someone young and optimistic and untouched by serious tragedy. But she had chosen instead to be exactly who she was, to trust that somewhere in the vast expanse of the American frontier, there might be someone who could see past the black dresses to the woman beneath. The prairie landscape rolling past her window was unlike anything she had ever seen, vast and empty and beautiful in its own austere way. It reminded her of the way grief had felt in the early days after Timothy's death, overwhelming and endless and somehow both terrifying and peaceful. At the same time, she wondered if this land, like loss, had a way of stripping away everything unnecessary and leaving only what was essential. If the people who chose to make their lives here had learned the same lessons about strength and endurance that she had learned through her own trials. As the train began to slow and the buildings of Willowbrook came into view, Clara smoothed her black skirts and checked her reflection in the window glass. She saw the same woman she'd been seeing for 3 years and 4 months, but today there was something different in her eyes, a mixture of hope and determination that had been missing for too long. She had come too far to doubt herself now, had invested too much in the possibility of a new beginning to let fear or uncertainty turn her back toward the life she had left behind. The train whistle announced their arrival with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire prairie, and Clara gathered her few belongings and prepared to step into whatever future awaited her in this small Kansas town. She had no way of knowing that the man who had written those encouraging letters was even now standing on the platform, or that the townspeople gathering to see who had arrived on the afternoon train were about to witness an encounter that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, loss, and the courage required to build a life on the frontier. Part 3. Supporting character and problem revelation. Thomas Bridwell had been Willowbrook's Undertaker for 6 years, and in that time he had learned more about the town's heart than most people discovered in a lifetime. He had held the hands of grieving widows, had helped fathers carry their children to final rest, had seen the raw humanity that emerged when people faced the one certainty that united every soul who had ever drawn breath. His work had taught him that death was not the enemy that most people believed it to be, but rather a teacher that revealed the true value of every moment that came before it, and that the most profound beauty often emerged from the deepest sorrow. The funeral parlor occupied a modest building on Elm Street, just far enough from Main Street to provide privacy for grieving families, but close enough to be easily accessible when needed. The front room served as a chapel where services were held, with simple wooden pews and tall windows that let in the prairie light. Behind that was Tom's workshop, where he crafted the coffins that would carry Willowbrook's residents to their final rest, each one built with the same careful attention to detail that he brought to every aspect of his work. The smell of wood shavings and linseed oil permeated the building, mixing with the scent of the flowers that mourners brought to honor their dead. Tom was a man of 32 who had come to his profession not by choice but by necessity, after an injury to his left leg in a mill accident had ended his hopes of following his father into farming. The leg had healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent limp that made the physical demands of agricultural work impossible. But it had also given him a different perspective on life's fragility and the importance of treating each day as the gift it was. He had apprenticed with the town's previous undertaker, an elderly man named Moses Garrett, who had taught him that caring for the dead was really about caring for the living, about helping families through their darkest hours with dignity and compassion. The townspeople of Willowbrook had initially been uncertain about the young man who had taken over such a solemn profession, But Tom had quickly earned their respect through his gentle manner and his commitment to treating every death with the same reverence, regardless of the deceased's social standing or financial circumstances. He had buried paupers with the same care he showed to the town's most prominent citizens, had sat with families who had no one else to comfort them, had never once rushed a grieving person through their final goodbye. His reputation for kindness and integrity had spread throughout the county, and families from neighboring towns sometimes traveled considerable distances to ensure their loved ones received the care that Tom provided. But Tom's profession had also made him something of an outsider in Willowbrook's social circles. People were grateful for his services when they needed them, but they were reluctant to invite death's representative to their dinner parties and social gatherings. He attended church regularly and was respected by his neighbors, but he was rarely included in the everyday socializing that bound the community together. Women of marriageable age seemed to find him either too morbid or too old, and their families often steered them towards suitors with more conventional occupations and brighter prospects. The loneliness had begun to weigh on Tom more heavily as he approached his mid-30s and watched his former schoolmates marry and start families while he remained solitary in his work and his life. He had tried to court several women over the years, but the conversations always seemed to falter when they learned about his profession, as if the mere mention of death and burial was enough to extinguish any romantic interest. He had begun to wonder if his calling, which felt so right and necessary to him, had sentenced him to a life of permanent isolation from the kind of companionship that made all the other struggles worthwhile. It was Maggie Henley who had first suggested that Tom might find happiness through her matchmaking services, pointing out that somewhere in the vast expanse of the country there might be a woman who could appreciate his gentle nature and his dedication to serving others, even if that service involved the town's most difficult moments. Maggie had a way of seeing past the surface of things, of understanding that the qualities that made Tom excellent at his profession, his compassion and his comfort with life's harder truths, might also make him an excellent husband to the right woman. Tom had been reluctant at first, concerned that any woman who responded to his letters would be unprepared for the realities of being married to someone in his profession. But Maggie had convinced him that honesty was the best foundation for any relationship, that a woman who could accept him as he was would be worth more than a dozen who might be attracted to him under false pretenses. So he had written his first letter, explaining his work and his life with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything else, and had waited to see if anyone would respond. The response from Clara Whitmore had surprised him with its directness and its obvious understanding of loss and grief. Here was a woman who had faced tragedy and had chosen to acknowledge it rather than hide from it, who had made difficult choices and had lived with the consequences without complaint or self-pity. Her description of her work caring for the dying and helping families through their grief had resonated with Tom's own experiences, and he had found himself looking forward to her letters with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. As their correspondence had continued, Tom had begun to believe that he might have found someone who could understand not just his profession, but the man behind it. Clara wrote about death and loss with the same matter-of-fact acceptance that he tried to bring to his work, but she also wrote about hope and the possibility of new beginnings with a sincerity that touched something deep in his heart. Her letters revealed a woman who had been tested by life and had emerged stronger rather than bitter, someone who might be able to see past the stigma of his profession to the person he really was. But Tom was also aware that Willowbrook was not St. Louis, and that a woman who had managed to make her way in a large city might find the social constraints of a small prairie town more challenging than she expected. He had tried to prepare Clara for the realities of life in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where unconventional choices were noticed and discussed, where first impressions carried enormous weight. He had warned her that some people might be put off by her black dresses, But he had also assured her that there were others who would see past appearances to the person beneath. What Tom hadn't fully anticipated was the extent to which the town's social leaders would react to Clara's arrival. He had expected some initial curiosity and perhaps a period of adjustment as people got to know her, but he had underestimated the power of Samuel Fletcher's opinions and the influence he wielded over Willowbrook's social atmosphere. Samuel had made it clear in recent weeks that he expected any woman joining the community to meet certain standards of appearance and behavior, and that he considered the town's reputation to be at stake whenever newcomers arrived. The problem had been building for months, ever since Samuel had begun talking about Willowbrook's need to attract the right kind of settlers as the railroad brought more opportunities for growth and development. He had expressed concerns about the town's image, about the importance of maintaining standards that would attract respectable families and successful businesses. He had begun to see himself as a guardian of the community's values, someone who had a responsibility to ensure that Willowbrook developed in ways that would enhance rather than diminish its reputation. Samuel's wife Sarah had been equally vocal about her concerns, particularly regarding the kinds of women who were coming west through various matchmaking services. She had heard stories from other towns about mail-order brides who had arrived with questionable backgrounds or inappropriate expectations, and she had begun to worry that Willowbrook's reputation for respectability might be compromised by the wrong kind of newcomer. She had made it clear that she expected any woman joining the community to meet the same standards of dress and behavior that she maintained herself. The tension had been growing for weeks, and Tom had begun to sense that Clara's arrival might precipitate a crisis that would test not just his relationship with her but his standing in the community he had served faithfully for 6 years. He had tried to prepare both Clara and himself for the possibility that their courtship might face opposition, but he had also hoped that his reputation and Clara's obvious character would be enough to overcome any initial prejudices. Dr. Walsh had been one of the few people who had expressed support for Tom's correspondence with Clara, recognizing that the Undertaker's loneliness was becoming a genuine concern for his well-being. The doctor had seen how Tom's isolation was affecting him, how the lack of companionship was beginning to take a toll on his health and his spirits. He had encouraged Tom to pursue the relationship, arguing that a man who had devoted his life to serving others deserved the chance to find happiness, regardless of what others might think about his choice of profession or his correspondent's choice of clothing. Pastor Cross had also been supportive, though more cautiously so. He had counseled Tom about the importance of building a relationship on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect, but he had also warned him that the path might not be easy if Clara's appearance or background triggered opposition from some members of the congregation. The pastor had promised to support Tom's right to make his own choices, but he had also made it clear that he expected both Tom and Clara to conduct themselves in ways that would honor the community's values. As the day of Clara's arrival approached, Tom had found himself caught between excitement and anxiety, eager to finally meet the woman whose letters had brought such hope into his life, but also worried about the reception she might receive from his neighbors and friends. He had done everything he could to prepare the way for her, speaking positively about her character and her circumstances to anyone who would listen, but he had also sensed an undercurrent of resistance that might prove more challenging than he had anticipated. The morning of her arrival, Tom had dressed carefully in his best suit, had polished his shoes and combed his hair, and had walked to the depot with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation that reminded him of his first day as the town's undertaker. He had no way of knowing that Samuel Fletcher had also decided to be present at the depot, ostensibly to welcome the newcomer, but actually to assess whether she met his standards for the kind of woman Willowbrook should be encouraging to settle in their community. Part 4. The Turning Point Decision. The afternoon train arrived in Willowbrook with its usual fanfare of steam and steel, but the small crowd gathered at the depot sensed that this particular arrival might be different from A routine parade of traveling salesmen and visiting relatives who typically stepped onto their platform. Word had spread through the town that Tom Bridwell's mail-order bride was arriving on the 3:15 from Kansas City, and curiosity had drawn more spectators than usual to witness the meeting between the town's Undertaker and the woman who had been corresponding with him for months. Samuel Fletcher stood near the depot office, his wife Sarah beside him, both of them positioned to get a clear view of whoever might emerge from the passenger car. Samuel had dressed in his finest suit for the occasion, his gold watch chain gleaming. Across his vest, his bearing that of a man who considered himself responsible for maintaining the town's standards and reputation. Sarah wore her newest dress, a confection of blue silk and white lace that had been specially ordered from a Kansas City department store, her appearance calculated to demonstrate the level of refinement that she believed Willowbrook's leading family should exemplify. Tom waited closer to the platform, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression a mixture of nervous anticipation and quiet determination. He had spent the morning rehearsing what he would say when Clara stepped off the train, how he would introduce her to the townspeople who had gathered to witness their first meeting, how he would navigate the delicate social situation that her arrival was certain to create. He had also spent considerable time thinking about the letters they had exchanged, about the woman those letters had revealed, and about his hopes for the future they might build together. Dr. Walsh had positioned himself near the back of the small crowd, his medical bag in hand as always, his presence serving the dual purpose of satisfying his own curiosity and providing a friendly face for the newcomer if she should need one. He had known Tom for years and had seen how the Undertaker's loneliness had been affecting his health and spirits, and he genuinely hoped that this meeting would mark the beginning of a happier chapter in his friend's life. The doctor had also heard enough of the whispered conversations around town to know that not everyone was prepared to welcome Tom's bride with open arms. Maggie Henley stood near the telegraph office, her notebook in hand, ready to record her observations of the meeting she had helped to arrange. As the town's unofficial matchmaker, she had a professional interest in the success of this particular union, but she also had a personal fondness for Tom and a hope that her efforts would result in genuine happiness for both parties. She had been impressed by Clara's letters, by the honesty and dignity they had revealed, and she was prepared to defend her matchmaking judgment if necessary. Pastor Cross had also come to observe the arrival, though he had positioned himself somewhat apart from the main crowd, his presence intended to be supportive but not intrusive. He had counseled Tom about the importance of building a relationship on a foundation of shared faith and mutual respect, and he was curious to meet the woman who had captured the Undertaker's interest. The pastor had also heard the concerns that some of his parishioners had expressed about mail-order marriages in general, and he was prepared to offer guidance and support if the situation required it. When the train finally hissed to a stop and the conductor stepped down to place his wooden steps beside the passenger car, the crowd fell silent, every eye focused on the doorway from which Tom's bride would emerge. The first passengers to disembark were a traveling salesman with a sample case and an elderly woman visiting her daughter, both of them familiar types who drew little attention from the waiting crowd. Then came a young man in a city suit who looked around uncertainly before heading toward the street, clearly not the person everyone had come to see. Finally, a figure in black appeared in the doorway of the passenger car, and the crowd drew a collective breath as Clara Whitmore stepped onto the platform. She was dressed entirely in black, from her simple woolen dress to her small hat and gloves, her appearance so stark and unexpected that several people in the crowd took an involuntary step backward. The contrast between her somber clothing and the bright afternoon sunshine was striking, and for a moment no one seemed to know quite how to react to this woman, who looked more like a mourner at a funeral than a bride meeting her intended husband. Clara paused at the bottom of the steps, her carpetbag in her hand, her green eyes scanning the crowd until they found Tom's familiar face. She had expected to feel nervous at this moment, but instead she felt a strange sense of calm, as if all the decisions that had brought her to this platform had been leading to this exact moment. She could see the surprise and uncertainty in the faces around her, could feel the weight of their stares and their whispered comments, but she also saw something else in Tom's expression that gave her courage to take the first step toward whatever future awaited her. Tom moved forward immediately, his limp barely noticeable in his eagerness to reach Clara's side. He had been prepared for her black dress, had understood from her letters that she chose to dress in mourning colors, but seeing her in person for the first time was still a shock that took him a moment to process. She was more beautiful than he had imagined, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light, her face more delicate than her letters had suggested, but it was her eyes that captured his attention, green and deep and filled with a kind of quiet strength that made him forget everything else. "Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his hat and offering a slight bow. "Welcome to Willowbrook." "Mr. Bridwell," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the curious stares of the crowd. "Thank you for meeting me." The exchange was polite and formal, but there was something in the way they looked at each other that suggested a deeper recognition, as if the months of correspondence had created a connection that transcended the awkwardness of this first meeting. Tom offered his arm, and Clara accepted it gracefully, allowing him to escort her away from the train and toward the crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness their introduction. It was then that Samuel Fletcher stepped forward, his expression grave and his manner suggesting that he had appointed himself as the town's official representative for this occasion. His wife Sarah remained at his side, her face a mask of polite disapproval, her eyes taking in every detail of Clara's appearance with obvious dismay. The other townspeople seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, and they pressed closer to hear what Samuel might have to say. "Mr. Bridwell," Samuel began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed, "I believe introductions are in order." Tom felt Clara's hand tighten slightly on his arm, and he sensed that she understood as well. As he did that, this was not going to be a simple social pleasantry. "Of course," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "May I present Miss Clara Whitmore of St. Louis? Clara, this is Mr. Samuel Fletcher, one of our town's leading citizens, and his wife, Mrs. Sarah Fletcher." Samuel nodded curtly, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone suggesting that he found something objectionable in her very presence, "I trust your journey was comfortable." "It was, thank you," Clara replied, her voice as steady as her gaze. She had encountered disapproval before, had learned to recognize the signs of social rejection, and she was prepared to meet whatever challenges this man might present. "I must say," Samuel continued, "your choice of attire is quite unusual for such an occasion. Are you perhaps in mourning?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Clara felt every eye in the crowd focused on her as she considered her response. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during the long train ride across the prairie, but facing it in person was still more difficult than she had anticipated. She could feel Tom's tension beside her, could sense the crowd's expectation, could almost hear the whispered judgments that would follow whatever answer she gave. "I am not in mourning in the traditional sense," Clara replied finally, her voice clear and dignified. "I choose to dress in black because I believe it represents an honest acknowledgement of life's realities, both its sorrows and its joys. I find it inappropriate to pretend that loss and grief are not part of the human experience." Her answer seemed to surprise Samuel, who had clearly expected either a simple explanation or an apology for her unconventional appearance. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who was willing to defend her choices with eloquence and conviction, and for a moment he seemed uncertain how to respond. "I see," he said finally, his tone suggesting that he did not see at all. "Well, I suppose we all have our own ways of expressing ourselves. However, I hope you understand that Willowbrook is a respectable community with certain expectations. Regarding appropriate dress and behavior, we have worked hard to build a reputation for refinement and propriety, and we naturally expect newcomers to respect those standards. The meaning of his words was clear to everyone present, and Clara felt the weight of the community's judgment settling around her like a shroud. She had faced rejection before, had learned to live with the consequences of her unconventional choices. But she had hoped that this place, this man who had written such understanding letters, might be different. Now she found herself wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in coming so far for what might prove to be another disappointment. But as she looked at Tom's face, she saw something that gave her hope. His expression was troubled, but it was not the trouble of a man who was ashamed of her appearance or regretting his invitation. Instead, it was the expression of someone who was angry on her behalf, someone who was preparing to defend her against the judgment of others. The realization filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sunshine and everything to do with the possibility that she had finally found someone who might truly understand her. "Mr. Fletcher," Tom said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that surprised everyone present. "Miss Whitmore has traveled a considerable distance to be here, and I believe she deserves a warmer welcome than what you're providing. Her choice of clothing is her own business, and I see nothing inappropriate about it." The challenge in Tom's voice was unmistakable, and Samuel's face flushed with anger at being contradicted in front of the entire crowd. "Mr. Bridwell," he replied, his voice rising slightly, "I am simply expressing the concerns of many in this community about the kind of image we present to the world. Surely you can understand that a woman's appearance reflects not just on herself, but on the entire town." "What I understand," Tom replied, his voice growing stronger, "is that Miss Whitmore is a lady of character and dignity, and that her worth is not determined by the color of her dress. Anyone who takes the time to get to know her will discover that she has much to offer this community." The confrontation between the two men had drawn the attention of everyone at the depot, and Clara found herself at the center of a conflict that seemed to involve much more than just her clothing choices. She realized that this was not just about her acceptance into the community, but about the kind of community Willowbrook would choose to be, and about whether its people would be guided by fear and prejudice, or by compassion and understanding. Part 5. The Plan in Motion. The tension at the depot had crystallized into something that would define not just Clara's place in Willowbrook, but the very character of the community itself. Tom's public defense of her had drawn a line in the social sand, and Clara realized that her response to this moment would determine whether that line became a bridge or a permanent divide. She had faced rejection before, had learned to live with the consequences of her unconventional choices, but she had never been in a position where her presence might force an entire community to examine its own values and prejudices. "Mr. Fletcher," Clara said, her voice carrying across the depot platform with a clarity that surprised everyone present, including herself. "I appreciate your concern for the community's reputation, and I understand that my appearance may seem unusual to those who don't know my circumstances. But I would ask you to consider that true respectability comes not from conforming to superficial expectations, but from living with integrity and treating others with dignity and compassion." Her words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and Clara could see the crowd processing what she had said. Some faces showing surprise at her eloquence, others revealing a grudging respect for her willingness to stand her ground. She had learned over the years that people often expected women in difficult circumstances to be either defensive or apologetic, and her calm, reasoned response had clearly caught them off guard. Samuel Fletcher's face had darkened with anger. At being lectured by a woman he had already decided was unsuitable for his community, but before he could respond, Dr. Walsh stepped forward from the back of the crowd. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice warm and welcoming, "I'm Dr. James Walsh, and I want to add my welcome to Tom's. Your journey must have been tiring, And I'm sure you'd appreciate the chance to rest and refresh yourself before dealing with any more of our local politics." The doctor's intervention provided a graceful exit from the confrontation, and Clara felt a surge of gratitude for his kindness. "Thank you, Dr. Walsh," she replied. "That's very thoughtful of you." Maggie Henley had also moved closer to the group, her notebook forgotten in her obvious concern for the woman whose correspondence she had helped to arrange. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I'm Maggie Henley, the postmistress. I've been looking forward to meeting you, and I hope you'll allow me to show you around town once you've had a chance to settle in." The support from Dr. Walsh and Maggie seemed to encourage others in the crowd to step forward with their own welcoming words, and Clara found herself being introduced to a succession of townspeople who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her rather than simply judging her by her appearance. There was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the boarding house owner, who offered to prepare a room if Clara needed accommodation while she and Tom got better acquainted. There was Pete Morrison, the depot master, who commented that he had seen all kinds of travelers in his years on the platform and had learned that appearances could be deceiving. But Clara was also aware of the people who remained silent, who stood at the edges of the crowd with expressions that ranged from curious to disapproving. She could see Sarah Fletcher whispering urgently to a group of other women, their eyes flicking back and forth between Clara and their own carefully coordinated outfits. She noticed several men standing near Samuel, their faces reflecting his own disapproval, their presence suggesting that the opposition to her arrival was not limited to a single individual. Tom had remained at her side throughout the introductions, his hand resting lightly on her arm in a gesture that was both protective and supportive. Clara could feel the tension in his body, could sense his anger at the way she had been received. But she could also feel his determination to stand by her regardless of the consequences. The realization that she had found someone willing to defend her choices, even at the cost of his own social standing, was both humbling and inspiring. "Perhaps," Tom said, addressing the crowd in general, "we should allow Miss Whitmore to rest after her journey. There will be plenty of time for everyone to get acquainted in the days to come." It was a polite way of ending the confrontation, but Clara could sense that the real battle was just beginning. As the crowd began to disperse, she noticed the way people seemed to be dividing into two groups, those who had welcomed her and those who had remained silent or disapproving. She realized that her arrival had forced the community to take sides, and that the consequences of that division would affect not just her own future, but the relationships between neighbors who had lived peacefully together for years. Samuel Fletcher was among the last to leave the depot, his parting words clearly intended to be heard by everyone present. "I hope, Miss Whitmore, that you will consider carefully what kind of impression you wish to make on our community. First impressions, as I'm sure you know, can be quite lasting." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October afternoon. She had encountered powerful men before, had learned to recognize the signs of someone who was accustomed to getting his way and who did not respond well to being challenged, especially by someone he considered beneath his social station. But she had also learned that backing down from such challenges often led to greater difficulties than facing them head-on, and she had no intention of allowing Samuel Fletcher or anyone else to dictate how she would live her life in Willowbrook. As the depot platform emptied, Tom turned to Clara with an expression that mixed concern with admiration. "I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "Samuel Fletcher has strong opinions about how things should be done in this town, but he doesn't speak for everyone." "I can see that," Clara replied, glancing around at the few people who had lingered to offer additional words of welcome. "And I appreciate your willingness to stand up for me, even though it may have made things more difficult for you." Tom's response was immediate and firm. "Clara, I want you to understand something from the very beginning. I didn't ask you to come here so that you could change yourself to fit other people's expectations. I asked you to come because your letters showed me a woman of character and strength, someone who had faced adversity with dignity and grace. That's the woman I want to get to know better, not some version of yourself that you might create to please people like Samuel Fletcher." His words carried a conviction that touched something deep in Clara's heart, and she felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had valued her for exactly who she was, so long since she had felt that her choices and her character were appreciated rather than merely tolerated. The realization that Tom's letters had not been written out of desperation or loneliness, but out of genuine admiration for the woman she had become, filled her with a hope she had almost forgotten how to feel. "Thank you," she said simply, but Tom could hear the depth of emotion in those two words, could see in her eyes how much his support meant to her. Dr. Walsh had approached them again, his medical bag in hand and his expression thoughtful. "Tom," he said, "why don't you take Miss Whitmore to my office so she can rest for a few minutes before you show her around town? She's had a long journey, and I imagine the reception here was more challenging than she expected." The suggestion was both practical and kind, offering Clara a chance to recover from the confrontation while also giving Tom an opportunity to prepare her for whatever other challenges might lie ahead. Clara accepted gratefully, and the three of them walked slowly toward Dr. Walsh's office, Tom matching his pace to accommodate his limp and Clara's need to take in her surroundings. Willowbrook's main street stretched before them like a promise and a challenge combined, its wooden storefronts and wide sidewalks representing both the opportunities and the obstacles that lay ahead. Clara could see people watching from windows and doorways, their curiosity about the woman in black evident in their lingering stares and whispered conversations. She realized that her arrival had already become the day's main topic of conversation, and that every step she took, every word she spoke, would be analyzed and discussed by people who were still deciding whether she belonged in their community. The doctor's office occupied the ground floor of a neat two-story building, with a painted sign that proclaimed James Walsh, M.D., in dignified letters. The waiting room was simple but clean, with wooden chairs arranged along the walls and windows that looked out onto Main Street. Dr. Walsh ushered them into his private office, where Clara could sit in a comfortable chair and collect herself after the unexpected intensity of her arrival. "Miss Whitmore," Dr. Walsh said, settling himself behind his desk, "I hope you won't judge our entire community by Samuel Fletcher's behavior today. He's a good man in many ways, but he sometimes forgets that strength comes in many different forms, and that the best communities are those that welcome people who bring different perspectives and experiences." Clara appreciated the doctor's attempt to provide context for what had happened at the depot, but she was also realistic about the challenges that lay ahead. "I understand that my appearance is unconventional," she said, "and I don't expect everyone to approve of my choices. But I also hope that people will be willing to get to know me before they decide that I don't belong here." "That's all anyone can ask," Dr. Walsh replied. "And I think you'll find that most people in Willowbrook are fair-minded once they get past their initial impressions. Samuel Fletcher's opinion carries weight in this town, but it's not the only opinion that matters." Tom had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, realizing that Clara's situation was going to be more difficult than he had anticipated. He had known that some people might be initially surprised by her appearance, but he had underestimated the strength of the opposition she would face from the town's social leaders. The confrontation at the depot had made it clear that Clara's acceptance into the community would require more than just time and patience. It would require a fundamental change in how some people thought about conformity and social expectations. "Clara," Tom said, his voice serious, "I want you to know that you're not alone in this. There are people in this town who will support you, who will see past your black dresses to the person you really are. But I also want you to be prepared for the fact that it may take time and that there may be more challenges ahead." Clara had been thinking the same thing, and she appreciated Tom's honesty about the situation. "I've faced opposition before," she said quietly. "I've learned that people's first reactions aren't always their final ones, and that sometimes the most worthwhile relationships are those that require some effort to build." Dr. Walsh nodded approvingly at her response. "That's a wise attitude," he said. "And I suspect that once people see how you conduct yourself, once they see the kind of person you are, many of the initial objections will fade away." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door, and Maggie Henley peered inside with an expression of barely contained excitement. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, "but I wondered if Miss Whitmore might like to see the post office and perhaps meet a few more people before the day gets too late." Clara looked to Tom for guidance, and he nodded encouragingly. "Maggie knows everyone in town," he said, "and she has a gift for helping people find their place in the community. If you're feeling up to it, I think it would be good for you to start meeting your neighbors." The prospect of facing more curious stares and potential criticism was daunting, but Clara realized that hiding in the doctor's office would only postpone the inevitable. If she was going to make a life in Willowbrook, she would need to face whatever reactions her presence provoked, and she would need to do it with the same dignity and grace she had tried to maintain throughout all of her previous challenges. "I'd be honored to see the post office," Clara said to Maggie, "and to meet anyone you think I should know." Maggie's face lit up with pleasure, and Clara could see that the postmistress was genuinely excited about the prospect of introducing her to the community. "Wonderful," Maggie said. "I think you'll find that most people are quite eager to get to know you better once they get past their initial surprise." As they prepared to leave the doctor's office, Tom took Clara's arm again, his touch gentle but unmistakably protective. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked quietly. "We could wait until tomorrow if you'd prefer to rest first." Clara appreciated his concern, but she had learned over the years that difficult situations rarely improved by being postponed. "I'm ready," she said, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. "The sooner people get used to seeing me around town, the sooner they'll start thinking of me as a person rather than as a curiosity." The walk from Dr. Walsh's office to the post office took them directly down Main Street, and Clara could feel eyes watching their progress from every window and doorway they passed. Some people offered tentative nods or smiles, while others simply stared with expressions that ranged from curious to disapproving. She realized that her black dress, which had provided her with a sense of identity and purpose in St. Louis, was going to be a source of constant attention in a community where conformity was clearly valued more highly than individual expression. The post office occupied a corner building near the center of town, with large windows that allowed plenty of natural light and a counter that served as the hub for all of Willowbrook's communication with the outside world. Maggie's domain was clearly organized and efficiently run, with rows of mailboxes along one wall and a small desk where she conducted her unofficial matchmaking business. The smell of ink and paper filled the air, mixed with the scent of the flowers that Maggie kept in a vase near the window. "This is where it all began," Maggie said with obvious pride, gesturing toward the desk where she had first read Tom's letter seeking a wife. "I like to think that the post office is where hearts connect across great distances, where lonely souls find their matches and new chapters begin." Clara could see why Tom had been drawn to work with Maggie in finding a wife. The postmistress had a romantic view of her role in bringing people together, but she also had a practical understanding of what made relationships work. Her office walls were decorated with letters and photographs from couples she had helped to unite, testament to her success in matching compatible personalities and complementary dreams. "Tom tells me you have experience caring for people during difficult times," Maggie said as she showed Clara around the post office. "That's a valuable skill in a community like this, where neighbors depend on each other during times of trouble." The comment reminded Clara that her unconventional background might actually be an asset in some situations, even if it made her appear unsuitable in others. Her experience with grief and loss, her comfort with life's difficult realities might be appreciated by people who faced their own challenges and needed someone who understood that strength came in many different forms. I've found that people are often grateful for someone who's not afraid to acknowledge that life can be difficult, Clara replied. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is simply be present with someone during their darkest moments, without trying to make everything seem better than it is. Maggie nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly the kind of wisdom this community needs, she said. We've had our share of losses over the years, and people here understand the value of someone who can face hard truths with grace and dignity. As they talked, several townspeople had gathered outside the post office, drawn by curiosity about the woman in black who had arrived on the afternoon train. Clara could see them through the windows, their faces reflecting a mixture of interest and uncertainty, as they debated whether to come inside and introduce themselves or to maintain their distance until they better understood what kind of person she was. Tom had been watching the growing crowd with concern, realizing that Clara was about to face another test of her ability to win over people who had already formed preliminary opinions about her suitability for their community. Perhaps we should invite them in, he suggested to Maggie. It might be better to address their curiosity directly rather than letting it build into something larger. Maggie agreed immediately, and she stepped to the door to invite the gathered townspeople inside. Come in, she called cheerfully. Miss Whitmore would be delighted to meet you all properly. The invitation seemed to break the spell of uncertainty that had kept people gathered outside, and gradually they began to file into the post office, their expressions ranging from friendly curiosity to polite skepticism. Clara found herself at the center of a receiving line of sorts, shaking hands and making small talk with people who were clearly trying to form their own opinions about her character and her potential place in their community. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell was among the first to step forward, her manner warm and welcoming despite her obvious surprise at Clara's appearance. Miss Whitmore, she said, I run the boarding house here in town, and I want you to know that you're welcome to stay with me for as long as you need while you and Tom get better acquainted. The offer was both practical and kind, providing Clara with an alternative to the awkward situation of staying with Tom before they were properly married, while also sending a signal to the community that at least some of its leading citizens were prepared to welcome her. Clara accepted gratefully, realizing that Mrs. Hartwell's support might be crucial in determining how other women in the community would respond to her presence. That's very generous of you, Clara replied. I appreciate your kindness, and I look forward to getting to know you better. Other introductions followed in rapid succession. There was Pete Morrison, the depot master, who commented that he had seen all kinds of people pass through Willowbrook over the years and had learned that the most interesting ones were often those who looked different from everyone else. There was Frank Sullivan, the blacksmith, whose hands were permanently stained with soot, and who seemed amused by the idea that anyone would judge a person's worth by the color of their clothing. There was Mary Catherine O'Brien, a young Irish woman who worked as a seamstress and who looked at Clara's black dress with obvious professional interest. But Clara was also aware of the people who remained outside, who watched through the windows, without coming forward to introduce themselves. She could see Sarah Fletcher among them, her expression stern and disapproving, her presence serving as a reminder that not everyone in Willowbrook was prepared to welcome her with open arms. The sight of Samuel Fletcher's wife standing in obvious judgment outside the post office made it clear that the opposition to Clara's presence was organized and determined, and that winning acceptance from the entire community would require more than just friendly conversations with sympathetic individuals. As the informal reception continued, Clara began to get a sense of the social dynamics that governed life in Willowbrook. There were clearly different factions within the community, some more open to newcomers and change than others, some more influenced by the opinions of the Fletcher family than others. She realized that her presence had forced these underlying divisions to the surface, and that her future in the town would depend not just on her own behavior, but on which faction ultimately proved to be more influential in shaping community attitudes. Tom had remained close to her side throughout the introductions, his presence both supportive and protective. Clara could see that he was watching people's reactions carefully, taking note of who welcomed her warmly and who seemed more reserved, storing information that would help him navigate the social challenges that lay ahead. His obvious commitment to her, his willingness to stand by her despite the controversy her arrival had created, was becoming increasingly clear to everyone present. "Tom," said Frank Sullivan, the blacksmith, "you've chosen well. Miss Whitmore has the look of someone who's not afraid of hard work or hard truths, and that's exactly what this country needs more of." The compliment was clearly sincere, and it seemed to encourage others to express their own positive impressions. Mary Catherine O'Brien commented on the quality of Clara's dress, noting that it was well-made and practical, exactly the kind of clothing that made sense for frontier life. Pete Morrison mentioned that he had seen many mail-order brides arrive over the years, and that the ones who lasted were usually those who came with realistic expectations and strong characters rather than romantic illusions. But even as Clara received these encouraging words, she was aware that the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, as people had more opportunities to observe her behavior and decide whether she truly belonged in their community. The initial reactions were mixed, but they were just the beginning of a longer process of acceptance or rejection that would determine not just her own future, but the kind of community Willowbrook would choose to become. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd in the post office began to thin, Clara found herself feeling both hopeful and apprehensive about what lay ahead. She had met people who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her, people who were willing to look past her unconventional appearance to see the person beneath. But she had also sensed the undercurrent of opposition that threatened to make her life in Willowbrook more difficult than she had anticipated. When the last of the visitors had departed, Maggie turned to Clara with an expression of satisfaction and concern combined. "Well," she said, "I'd say that went better than I feared, but not as well as I hoped. You've made some friends today, but you've also confirmed some people's prejudices. The next few days will be crucial in determining which group ultimately prevails." Clara nodded, understanding that she was at the beginning of a process that would test not just her own resolve, but the character of the entire community. She had come to Willowbrook hoping to find acceptance and perhaps even love, but she was beginning to realize that her presence might force the town to confront some uncomfortable truths about itself and its values. The question now was whether the people of Willowbrook would choose to grow and change, or whether they would close ranks against anyone who challenged their assumptions about how life should be lived. As Tom prepared to escort her to the boarding house where she would spend her first night in Willowbrook, Clara felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination settling over her like a familiar garment. She had faced challenges before, had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics that governed life in close-knit communities, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to earn her place in this new home. But she was also aware that the outcome was not entirely in her control, and that the ultimate decision about her future in Willowbrook would be made, not just by her own actions, but by the choices of the people who were still deciding whether she was the kind of woman they wanted in their community. The evening light was painting Willowbrook's Main Street in shades of amber and gold when Tom finally escorted Clara to Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, their footsteps echoing softly on the wooden sidewalk as they walked past storefronts where lamplight was beginning to flicker behind glass windows. The day had been longer and more emotionally demanding than either of them had anticipated, filled with confrontations and revelations that had already begun to reshape the social landscape of the small prairie town. Clara carried her carpetbag with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the afternoon's challenges, but Tom could see the weariness in her shoulders and the determined set of her jaw that spoke of someone who had faced difficult battles before and was prepared to face whatever came next. Mrs. Hartwell met them at the front door of her establishment, her manner warm but observant as she took in Clara's appearance and demeanor. The boarding housekeeper had heard about the scene at the depot, had listened to the various accounts that had circulated through town during the afternoon, and she had formed her own opinions about the young woman who had arrived wearing black and carrying herself with such remarkable composure, despite the mixed reception she had received. Eleanor Hartwell had been running her boarding house for 5 years, and in that time she had developed an instinct for reading people's character that rarely proved wrong. "Miss Whitmore," she said, opening the door wide and stepping aside to welcome Clara into her home. "I have a lovely room prepared for you on the second floor, with windows that face east so you'll have plenty of morning sunlight. I think you'll find it comfortable, and I hope you'll consider it your home for as long as you need." The kindness in Mrs. Hartwell's voice was unmistakable, and Clara felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who was willing to offer hospitality without conditions or judgments. "Thank you so much," Clara replied. "Your generosity means more to me than you know, especially after such a challenging day." Tom lingered at the threshold, clearly reluctant to leave Clara to face whatever evening conversations might await her in the boarding house, but also understanding that propriety required them to maintain appropriate distance until their relationship had progressed further. "Clara," he said quietly, "would you like me to call for you in the morning? I could show you more of the town, perhaps introduce you to some of the people you didn't meet today." The suggestion was both thoughtful and practical, offering Clara the prospect of continuing to build relationships with potential allies while also providing her with Tom's support as she navigated the complex social terrain that her arrival had revealed. "I would appreciate that very much," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that made Tom's heart lift despite the difficulties they had already encountered. Mrs. Hartwell watched this exchange with the eye of someone who had seen many relationships begin and develop under her roof, and she was impressed by the obvious mutual respect and consideration that Clara and Tom showed for each other. "Mr. Bridwell," she said, "you're welcome to join us for breakfast tomorrow morning. I serve at 7, and I think Miss Whitmore might enjoy having a familiar face at the table." The invitation was another gesture of support, and Tom accepted gratefully before bidding Clara good night and walking back down Main Street toward his own home near the funeral parlor. As he made his way through the gathering darkness, he found himself thinking about the events of the day and the challenges that lay ahead. Clara's arrival had forced the community to confront some uncomfortable truths about itself, and Tom realized that the outcome of this confrontation would determine not just Clara's future, but the kind of man he would prove himself to be. Inside the boarding house, Mrs. Hartwell led Clara up a narrow staircase to the second floor, where a comfortable room with clean white curtains and a patchwork quilt awaited her. The space was simple but welcoming, with a washstand, a small desk, and a rocking chair positioned near the window where Clara could look out over the town's rooftops toward the prairie beyond. It was exactly the kind of refuge she needed after the emotional intensity of her arrival, a place where she could gather her thoughts and prepare for whatever tomorrow might bring. "The other guests are all respectable people," Mrs. Hartwell said as she showed Clara around the room. "There's Mr. Patterson, who's the new school teacher, and Miss Jenkins, who's visiting her sister for a few weeks. They're both pleasant company, and I think you'll find them welcoming." Clara appreciated the information, understanding that Mrs. Hartwell was preparing her for the social dynamics she would encounter at breakfast and in the common areas of the boarding house. "I look forward to meeting them," she said, though she was also aware that every new introduction would bring fresh opportunities for both acceptance and rejection. As Mrs. Hartwell prepared to leave Clara to settle in, She paused at the doorway with an expression that mixed concern with encouragement. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I want you to know that you have friends in this town, people who are willing to judge you by your character rather than your clothing. Samuel Fletcher's opinion carries weight, but it's not the only opinion that matters. And there are those of us who believe that Willowbrook will be stronger for having someone like you as part of our community." The words were exactly what Clara needed to hear after a day filled with uncertainty and challenge, and she felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your kindness gives me hope that I can find my place here." After Mrs. Hartwell had gone, Clara sat in the rocking chair by the window and looked out over the town where she hoped to make her new life. The streets were quiet now, with only occasional figures moving between the pools of lamplight that marked the main intersections. She could see the church steeple silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and beyond that the endless expanse of prairie that stretched away into darkness. It was a different world from the crowded streets of St. Louis, but there was something about its vastness and simplicity that appealed to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The next morning brought sunshine and the sound of birds singing in the maple trees that lined the boarding house's front yard. Clara dressed carefully in another of her black dresses, this one with small pearl buttons and modest lace trim that she hoped might soften her appearance without compromising her principles. She had learned over the years that small concessions to conventional expectations could sometimes open doors that might otherwise remain closed, and she was willing to make such adjustments if they helped her build the relationships she would need to establish herself in Willowbrook. Breakfast at Mrs. Hartwell's table proved to be a more pleasant experience than Clara had dared to hope. Mr. Patterson, the schoolteacher, was a thoughtful young man who showed genuine interest in Clara's background and experience, particularly her work caring for people during difficult times. Miss Jenkins was a cheerful woman in her 30s who had traveled widely and who seemed impressed by Clara's courage in coming so far to start a new life. Both of them treated Clara's black dress as simply another aspect of her appearance, no more remarkable than the color of her hair or eyes. "I think it's admirable that you're willing to acknowledge life's sorrows as well as its joys," Mr. Patterson said as they shared Mrs. Hartwell's excellent biscuits and preserves. "Too many people seem to think that happiness requires pretending that difficult things never happen, but that's not been my experience at all." Miss Jenkins nodded in agreement. "I've traveled through several states where I've met women who've faced real hardships, and I've noticed that the strongest ones are usually those who've learned to accept life as it comes rather than trying to pretend it's something it's not." These conversations gave Clara confidence that there were people in Willowbrook who could appreciate her perspective and her choices, even if others found them troubling or inappropriate. When Tom arrived at 7 o'clock as promised, she was ready to continue the process of introducing herself to the community and building the relationships that would determine her future in the small prairie town. Tom's manner was warm, but slightly formal as he greeted Clara and the other breakfast guests, clearly mindful of the proprieties that governed courtship in a close-knit community. But Clara could see in his eyes the same warmth and admiration that had come through in his letters, and she felt increasingly confident that their correspondence had created a foundation for something deeper and more lasting than mere convenience or loneliness. "I thought we might visit the church this morning," Tom said as they walked down Main Street together. "Pastor Cross is eager to meet you, and Sunday services are an important part of community life here. I think it would be good for people to see that you share their values, even if you express them differently." The suggestion made sense strategically, but Clara was also genuinely interested in meeting the pastor who would play such an important role in her spiritual life if she remained in Willowbrook. She had maintained her faith throughout all her trials and losses, had found comfort in the belief that suffering had meaning and that love was stronger than death, and she hoped to find a spiritual community that could appreciate her particular journey toward understanding. Pastor Cross proved to be a man of middle years with kind eyes and a manner that suggested both strength and compassion. His study was filled with books and papers that spoke of serious scholarship, but he also had a practical understanding of human nature that came from years of counseling people through their most difficult moments. When Tom introduced Clara, the pastor's response was welcoming but also thoughtfully observant. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "Tom has told me something of your background and your experiences. I understand that you faced considerable challenges in your life, and I want you to know that our church welcomes people who understand that faith is not about avoiding difficulty, but about finding meaning and purpose, even in the midst of sorrow." His words revealed an understanding of Clara's perspective that surprised her with its depth and accuracy. "Thank you, Pastor Cross," she replied. "I've found that my losses have actually strengthened my faith in many ways, though they've also taught me that some questions don't have easy answers." "That's a mature understanding," the pastor said approvingly. "I've always believed that the most authentic faith is one that's been tested by real experience, and I look forward to having you as part of our congregation if you decide to make Willowbrook your home." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, touching on questions of theology and practice that revealed both Clara's intelligence and her genuine spiritual commitment. Pastor Cross was clearly impressed by her thoughtfulness and her ability to articulate complex ideas about faith and suffering, and by the end of their meeting, he had become another ally in her effort to establish herself in the community. As they left the church, Tom's relief was evident in his expression and his manner. "I was hoping Pastor Cross would appreciate your perspective," he said, "and I can see that he does. His support will matter to a lot of people in this town, especially those who might be uncertain about how to respond to your arrival." The morning continued with visits to other important figures in Willowbrook's social landscape. They stopped at the general store, where Mr. Henderson proved to be a practical man who was more interested in Clara's character than her clothing choices. They visited the bank, where Mr. Morrison expressed appreciation for anyone who had the courage to start over in a new place. They called on Dr. Walsh again, who introduced Clara to several of his patients who happened to be in his waiting room. But Clara was also aware that not everyone in town was prepared to welcome her with such openness. As they walked down Main Street, she noticed people watching from windows and doorways, their expressions ranging from curious to disapproving. She saw Sarah Fletcher emerge from the general store with several other women, their conversations stopping abruptly when they noticed Clara approaching. The sight of Samuel Fletcher himself standing outside the bank, his expression stern and uncompromising, served as a reminder that her acceptance in Willowbrook was far from assured. The real test came on Sunday morning when Clara attended her first church service in Willowbrook. She had chosen her most conservative black dress, one with long sleeves and a high neckline that she hoped would demonstrate her respect for the occasion and the community sensibilities. Tom called for her at Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, and together they walked to the white-steepled church where most of the town's residents gathered each week for worship and social interaction. The moment Clara entered the sanctuary, she could feel every eye in the building focused on her. Conversations faltered and heads turned as people took in her appearance and tried to decide how to respond to this unusual newcomer. Tom led her to a pew near the front, where Dr. Walsh and his wife had saved them seats, but Clara was aware of the whispered conversations and meaningful glances that followed their progress down the aisle. Pastor Cross conducted the service with his usual dignity and warmth, and his sermon seemed designed to address some of the tensions that Clara's arrival had created in the community. He spoke about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to see the heart beneath, about the biblical injunction to welcome strangers and show hospitality to those who were different from themselves. His words were carefully chosen and thoughtfully delivered, but Clara could see that some members of the congregation were more receptive to his message than others. After the service, The real challenge began as people gathered outside the church for the social interactions that were such an important part of Willowbrook's weekly routine. Clara found herself at the center of a complex dance of acceptance and rejection, as various members of the congregation approached to introduce themselves or maintained their distance based on their own comfort levels and social allegiances. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher's mother, was among the first to welcome Clara warmly, commenting on her son's positive impression of her and expressing hope that Clara would find happiness in Willowbrook. Several other women followed her lead, offering invitations to social gatherings and expressing interest in getting to know Clara better. But Clara was also aware of the group that remained clustered around Sarah Fletcher, their expressions making it clear that they shared her disapproval of the newcomer's appearance and presence. The tension came to a head when Samuel Fletcher himself approached Clara and Tom, his manner formal and his words carefully chosen to be heard by as many people as possible. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I hope you've given some consideration to our conversation yesterday about the importance of appropriate dress and behavior in our community. Perhaps you might visit our local seamstress and consider expanding your wardrobe to include some more conventional choices." The suggestion was presented as helpful advice, but everyone present understood it as an ultimatum. Samuel Fletcher was making it clear that Clara's acceptance in Willowbrook was conditional on her willingness to abandon the black dresses that had become such an integral part of her identity and her way of processing her experiences of loss and grief. Clara felt the weight of the entire community's attention as she considered her response. She could see the hope in Tom's eyes, the encouragement in the faces of those who had welcomed her, and the expectant disapproval of those who were waiting for her to either submit to Samuel's demands or confirm their worst assumptions about her character. The moment felt like a crossroads, not just for her own future, but for the kind of community Willowbrook would choose to become. "Mr. Fletcher," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly across the churchyard, "I appreciate your concern for community standards, and I understand that my appearance may seem unusual to those who don't know my circumstances. But I cannot in good conscience abandon the choices I've made about how to dress and how to live my life, because those choices represent my honest response to the experiences that have shaped me. I hope that in time, people will judge me by my actions and my character rather than by the color of my clothing." Her response created a moment of complete silence as everyone present absorbed what she had said and began to understand that this was not a woman who would be easily pressured into conformity. Some faces showed admiration for her courage, others reflected disapproval of her stubbornness, but everyone seemed to recognize that a line had been drawn and that the community would now have to decide which side of that line it wanted to stand on. Tom stepped forward immediately, his voice strong and clear as he addressed not just Samuel Fletcher, but the entire gathered congregation. "Clara has shown more courage in the past 2 days than most people show in a lifetime," he said. "She's traveled hundreds of miles to start a new life in a place where she knew no one. She's faced criticism and judgment with dignity and grace, and she's been honest about who she is and what she believes. Those are exactly the qualities we should value in this community, and I'm proud to stand beside her." His words seemed to break the spell of uncertainty that had held the crowd silent, and gradually people began to move and speak again as they processed what they had witnessed. Some approached Clara and Tom to offer words of support and encouragement, while others turned away with expressions that suggested they had made their own decisions about where their loyalties lay. Dr. Walsh was among the first to express his support, shaking Tom's hand and telling Clara that courage was always in short supply and should be treasured when it was found. Pastor Cross offered his blessing on their relationship and his hope that Clara would find the community she was seeking in Willowbrook. Mrs. Hartwell invited both of them to Sunday dinner, making it clear that Clara was welcome in her home and at her table regardless of what anyone else might think. But Clara was also aware of the people who remained silent, who gathered in small groups to discuss what they had witnessed without approaching her directly. She could see Samuel and Sarah Fletcher in earnest conversation with several other prominent families, their expressions suggesting that they were planning some kind of response to her refusal to conform to their expectations. As the crowd began to disperse and people headed home for their Sunday dinners, Clara found herself walking beside Tom with a mixture of relief and apprehension about what the coming week might bring. She had taken a stand that felt necessary and honest, but she was also realistic about the consequences that such stands often brought in close-knit communities where conformity was valued more highly than individual expression. "Are you sorry?" Tom asked quietly as they made their way back toward Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house. "Do you regret coming here or refusing to change your clothes to please Samuel Fletcher?" Clara considered the question carefully before answering. "No," she said finally. "I'm not sorry for coming here, and I'm not sorry for being honest about who I am. Whatever happens next, at least it will be based on the truth rather than on some false version of myself that I created to please other people." Her answer seemed to satisfy Tom, and Clara could see in his expression the same admiration and respect that had come through in his letters. "Good," he said simply, "because I didn't ask you to come here so that you could become someone else. I asked you to come because of who you already are." The week that followed brought both challenges and unexpected support as Clara continued to establish herself in Willowbrook. Some people remained distant or disapproving, clearly influenced by the Fletcher family's opinion that she was inappropriate for their community. But others seemed to be impressed by her refusal to compromise her principles, and she found herself welcomed into homes and social gatherings by families who valued character over conformity. The turning point came when Mrs. Patterson asked Clara to speak to her son's students about her experiences caring for people during difficult times. The presentation was well received by both the children and their parents, and it demonstrated Clara's ability to contribute meaningfully to the community's educational and social life. When Dr. Walsh asked her to assist with several difficult cases involving terminally ill patients, her gentle manner and practical skills earned her the respect of families who had initially been skeptical about her background and appearance. Perhaps most importantly, Clara's relationship with Tom continued to deepen as they spent more time together and discovered how well their personalities and values complemented each other. Their shared understanding of life's difficulties and their mutual commitment to facing challenges with honesty and dignity created a bond that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The final acceptance came on a cold November morning when Clara was called to help with the town's most respected elderly woman, Mrs. Margaret Adams, who was dying after a long illness. Clara's gentle care and her ability to comfort both the dying woman and her grieving family impressed everyone who witnessed it, including several people who had initially opposed her presence in the community. When Mrs. Adams passed peacefully with Clara holding her hand, the family asked Clara to help with the funeral preparations, working alongside Tom in his professional capacity. The sight of Clara and Tom working together to provide dignity and comfort during the community's time of loss seemed to change many people's perspectives about her role in Willowbrook. Here was a woman who understood grief and could help others navigate their own difficult journeys. Someone who brought strength and compassion to situations where both were desperately needed. Her black dresses, which had initially seemed morbid or inappropriate, now appeared to be exactly right for someone whose calling involved helping others through their darkest hours. By Christmas, Clara had become an accepted and valued member of the Willowbrook community, her contributions to the town's social and spiritual life recognized even by some who had initially opposed her presence. When she and Tom announced their engagement in New Year, the news was greeted with genuine celebration by most of the town's residents, and even Samuel Fletcher offered his congratulations, though with somewhat less enthusiasm than others showed. Their wedding took place in the spring, in the same white-steepled church where Clara had first faced the community's judgment and had chosen to remain true to herself rather than conform to others' expectations. She wore a black dress for the ceremony, as everyone had expected she would, but she also wore a white veil that had belonged to Tom's mother, a symbol of the new beginning they were creating together while honoring the experiences that had shaped them both. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, with the entire community invited to celebrate the union of two people who had found in each other the understanding and acceptance they had both been seeking. Clara's black dress no longer seemed unusual or inappropriate to the people who had come to know her as a woman of character and strength, someone who brought unique gifts to their community and who had enriched their understanding of what it meant to live with courage and integrity. As Clara and Tom danced their first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had learned to see past surface appearances to the hearts beneath, the story of the mail-order bride, who had been refused for wearing black, but had found love with the town's Undertaker, became part of Willowbrook's folklore. It was a story about the courage to be authentic in a world that often demanded conformity, about the possibility of finding acceptance and love even in the most unlikely circumstances, and about the way that true beauty revealed itself not in external appearances but in the strength of character and the depth of compassion that some people carried within themselves. Years later, when their children asked about how their parents had met and fallen in love, Clara and Tom would tell them about the day when a woman in black stepped off a train in Kansas and refused to change who she was to please others, and about how sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the courage to be exactly who you are, regardless of what anyone else might think. And in the telling of that story, their children learned lessons about authenticity and acceptance that would guide them throughout their own lives, just as the memory of Clara's courage continued to inspire the people of Willowbrook long after that first difficult day when she had chosen truth over convenience and love over conformity. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves through Willowbrook streets as Clara made her way to the general store, her black skirts rustling against the wooden sidewalk with each measured step. 3 months had passed since her arrival on that fateful October afternoon, and the town had gradually settled into a new rhythm that included her presence, though not without occasional reminders that some residents still harbored reservations about the woman who had refused to change her mourning attire to suit their expectations. The approaching winter had brought its own urgencies, and Clara had found herself increasingly involved in the community's preparations for the harsh months ahead, her practical skills and calm demeanor proving valuable in ways that transcended the initial controversy over her appearance. Inside Henderson's general store, Clara moved through the aisles with the quiet efficiency she had developed over months of learning where everything was kept, and who could be counted on for friendly conversation versus polite but distant service. She was gathering supplies for Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, having volunteered to help with the increased workload that came with preparing for winter guests, when she overheard a conversation between two women that made her pause behind a cake buffet behind a display of preserving jars. "I still say there's something unnatural about a woman who chooses to dress like death itself," Sarah Fletcher was saying to Mrs. Elizabeth Morton, the banker's wife. "It casts a shadow over everything, makes people think of sorrow and loss when they should be thinking of hope and joy. A proper woman understands that her appearance affects not just herself, but everyone around her." Mrs. Morton's response was more measured, but equally troubling. "I suppose she means well, and Tom certainly seems devoted to her, but I do worry about the example she sets for our young women. What if they decide that mourning dress is fashionable, or that they don't need to make any effort to please their husbands or their communities?" Clara felt her chest tighten with familiar disappointment, not because she was surprised by these sentiments, but because she had hoped that 3 months of consistent behavior and community service might have begun to change such deeply held prejudices. She had helped nurse sick children through the fever that had swept through town in November, had assisted Dr. Walsh with difficult cases that other women avoided, had even helped organize the church's charity drive for families struggling with the early onset of winter. Yet here were two prominent women discussing her as if she were a dangerous influence rather than a contributing member of their community. The conversation continued as Clara remained hidden behind the preserving jars, learning more about the ongoing opposition to her presence than she had realized existed. Sarah Fletcher had apparently been working steadily to maintain resistance to Clara's acceptance, organizing informal gatherings where like-minded women could express their concerns about the precedent her behavior might set. Mrs. Morton had been hosting tea parties where the conversation inevitably turned to questions of proper deportment and the importance of maintaining community standards that had served them well in the past. "Samuel believes we need to be more direct," Sarah Fletcher was saying as she examined a bolt of cheerful yellow fabric. "He thinks we've been too polite, too willing to hope that she'll eventually see reason and change her ways. But it's been 3 months now, and if anything, she seems more determined than ever to flaunt her unconventional choices." Clara's hands clenched involuntarily around the shopping basket she carried, and she had to take several deep breaths to maintain her composure. She had known that Samuel Fletcher remained opposed to her presence in Willowbrook, but she had underestimated the extent to which he and his wife were actively working to undermine her position in the community. The realization that they were planning some kind of more direct confrontation filled her with a mixture of anger and apprehension about what form such action might take. "What does he have in mind?" Mrs. Morton asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that Clara had to strain to hear. "He's talking to the other prominent men in town about the importance of maintaining standards that will attract the right kind of families to Willowbrook," Sarah replied. "He believes that if we're seen as the sort of place that tolerates inappropriate behavior, we'll attract more of the same kind of people, and eventually the town's reputation will suffer." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, and Clara used the distraction to slip away from her hiding place and complete her shopping without being detected. But the words she had overheard continued to echo in her mind as she walked back to the boarding house, her earlier sense of growing acceptance in the community now overshadowed by the knowledge that powerful forces were still working against her. That evening, as Clara helped Mrs. Hartwell prepare dinner for the boarding house guests, she found herself distracted and unusually quiet. The older woman, who had developed an almost maternal fondness for Clara over the months they had lived under the same roof, noticed the change in her demeanor immediately. "You seem troubled tonight, dear," Mrs. Hartwell said as they worked side by side in the kitchen. "Has something happened to upset you?" Clara hesitated, uncertain whether she should share what she had overheard or keep her concerns to herself. But Mrs. Hartwell had been such a consistent source of support and wisdom that Clara found herself telling the older woman about the conversation in the general store and her growing worry about what Samuel Fletcher might be planning. Mrs. Hartwell listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as Clara described the tone and content of the women's discussion. When Clara finished, the boarding house keeper was quiet for several long moments, clearly considering the implications of what she had heard. "I'm not entirely surprised," Mrs. Hartwell said finally. "Samuel Fletcher is a man who believes that his success in business gives him the right to control how other people live their lives. He's always been uncomfortable with anyone who doesn't fit his narrow definition of respectability, and I suspect your refusal to conform to his expectations has challenged his sense of authority in ways he's not prepared to tolerate." The analysis was both insightful and troubling, confirming Clara's growing sense that her situation in Willowbrook was more precarious than she had realized. "What do you think he might do?" she asked. "I'm not certain," Mrs. Hartwell replied, "but I suspect he'll try to pressure Tom to convince you to change your ways. Or failing that, he might try to make life uncomfortable enough for both of you that you'll decide to leave town voluntarily." The possibility that her presence might create serious difficulties for Tom was something Clara had been trying not to think about, but she could no longer avoid the reality that their relationship was placing him in an increasingly difficult position within the community. As the town's Undertaker, Tom depended on the goodwill of his neighbors for his livelihood, and if Samuel Fletcher succeeded in turning public opinion against Clara, it could have serious consequences for Tom's business and his standing in Willowbrook. The confrontation came sooner than Clara had expected, and in a more public forum than she had anticipated. The next Sunday morning, as the congregation gathered outside the church after services, Samuel Fletcher approached Clara and Tom with several other prominent men flanking him like an official delegation. Dr. Walsh and Pastor Cross were both present, their expressions suggesting that they had been expecting this encounter and were prepared to witness whatever transpired. "Mr. Bridwell, Miss Whitmore," Samuel began, his voice carrying clearly across the churchyard so that everyone present could hear what he was about to say. "I believe it's time we had a frank discussion about the standards and expectations that govern life in our community." Tom stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Clara and Samuel in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. "I'm not sure what you mean, Samuel," he replied, though his tone suggested that he understood perfectly well what was coming. "I think you do," Samuel continued, his gaze moving deliberately from Tom to Clara and back again. "We've been patient. We've been welcoming, but patience has its limits. Miss Whitmore's continued refusal to dress appropriately for our community gatherings has become a source of concern for many families, and her influence on our young women is beginning to cause problems that can no longer be ignored." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Clara felt every eye in the churchyard focused on her as she considered how to respond. She could see the faces of people who had become friends over the past 3 months, people who had welcomed her into their homes and their lives despite her unconventional appearance. She could also see the faces of those who had remained distant or disapproving, people who were now watching to see whether she would finally submit to the pressure to conform or continue to resist the community's expectations. "Mr. Fletcher," Clara said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her, "I understand your concerns, but I cannot abandon the choices I've made about how to live my life simply because they make some people uncomfortable. My clothing reflects my honest response to the experiences that have shaped me, and I will not pretend to be something I'm not in order to gain acceptance from those who value appearances more than character." Her response seemed to surprise Samuel, who had clearly expected either capitulation or a defensive argument that would make her appear unreasonable. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who was willing to articulate her position with dignity and conviction, even in the face of public pressure from the community's most influential citizens. "Character," Samuel repeated, his tone suggesting that he found the word inadequate. "Character is demonstrated through one's willingness to consider the needs and comfort of others, not through stubborn adherence to personal preferences that cause distress and concern throughout the community." The exchange had drawn the attention of the entire congregation, and Clara could see people positioning themselves to hear better, their faces reflecting the tension and drama of the moment. She realized that this was not just about her clothing or her place in Willowbrook, but about the fundamental question of whether the community would choose to embrace diversity or demand conformity from all its members. Pastor Cross stepped forward before Clara could respond, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should remember that our faith teaches us to look beyond external appearances, to see the heart beneath. Miss Whitmore has demonstrated her character through her actions and her service to this community, and I believe that should carry more weight than questions of fashion or convention." His intervention was both timely and courageous, and Clara felt a surge of gratitude for his willingness to speak on her behalf despite the obvious tension it created with some of his parishioners. But she could also see that his words had not settled the matter, and that Samuel Fletcher was prepared to continue pressing his case. "Pastor Cross, I respect your position," Samuel replied, "but I also believe that leadership sometimes requires making difficult decisions about what kinds of behavior we're willing to tolerate and what kinds we're not. The question isn't whether Miss Whitmore is a good person, but whether her refusal to respect our community standards sets a precedent that will ultimately harm our town's reputation and our ability to attract respectable families." The argument had shifted from Clara's personal choices to broader questions about community identity and leadership, and she realized that her presence had forced Willowbrook to confront fundamental questions about its own values and priorities. The outcome of this confrontation would determine not just her own future, but the kind of community Willowbrook would choose to become. Tom had been listening to this exchange with growing anger, and finally he could no longer remain silent. "Samuel," he said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone present, "you talk about standards and reputation as if they're more important than compassion and understanding. Clara has spent 3 months proving her worth to this community through her actions and her service, and if that's not enough to earn your acceptance, then perhaps the problem isn't with her, but with your definition of what makes someone worthy of belonging here." The challenge in Tom's words was unmistakable, and Samuel's face flushed with anger at being contradicted so directly in front of the entire congregation. "Mr. Bridwell," he replied, his voice rising slightly, "I had hoped that your personal feelings wouldn't blind you to your responsibilities to this community, but it appears I was mistaken." The confrontation had reached a point where compromise seemed impossible, and Clara realized that the time had come for her to make a choice that would determine not just her own future, but Tom's as well. She could continue to fight for acceptance on her own terms, knowing that the battle might ultimately cost Tom his standing in the community and his livelihood. Or she could find some way to bridge the gap between her principles and the community's expectations, though she was no longer certain that such a compromise was possible. As Clara stood in the churchyard, surrounded by the people who would determine her fate, she thought about all the choices that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the losses that had led her to embrace mourning dress as an honest expression of her understanding of life's realities. She thought about the letters she had exchanged with Tom and the hope they had kindled that she might find acceptance and love in this small prairie town. She thought about the friends she had made and the work she had done, and the ways in which her presence had enriched some lives while troubling others. Most of all, she thought about the woman she had become through all her trials and struggles, and whether she was willing to abandon that hard-won identity in order to gain the acceptance of people who might never truly understand or appreciate who she was. The answer, when it came to her, was both clear and costly, but it was also the only response that allowed her to remain true to herself and to the love she had found with Tom. "Mr. Fletcher," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent churchyard, "I came to Willowbrook hoping to find a place where I could be accepted for who I am, not for who others might want me to become. I have tried to contribute to this community through my actions and my service, and I will continue to do so for as long as I'm welcome here. But I will not change my clothing or my principles to satisfy those who value conformity more than authenticity, because to do so would be to betray everything I've learned about the importance of living honestly with one's own experiences and convictions." Her words created a moment of complete silence as everyone present absorbed what she had said and began to understand that this was a woman who would not be moved by pressure or persuasion from her chosen path. Some faces showed admiration for her courage, others reflected disapproval of her stubbornness, but everyone seemed to recognize that the battle lines had been drawn and that the community would now have to choose which side it wanted to support. The resolution came not from any single dramatic gesture, but from the gradual emergence of voices supporting Clara's right to remain in Willowbrook on her own terms. Dr. Walsh spoke about the valuable assistance she had provided in caring for the sick and dying. Mrs. Hartwell testified to her character and her contributions to the boarding house and the wider community. Mr. Patterson mentioned her positive influence on his students and her willingness to share her knowledge and experience with others. One by one, people who had come to know Clara through her actions rather than her appearance stepped forward to defend her place in their community. Even some who had initially been skeptical found themselves moved by the dignity with which she had conducted herself throughout the confrontation, and by her refusal to compromise her principles, even when faced with the possibility of rejection and exile. Samuel Fletcher found his support gradually eroding as more and more people decided that a woman who had shown such consistent character and courage deserved their respect and acceptance, regardless of her unconventional choices about clothing. In the end, it was Tom who provided the final word that settled the matter once and for all. "Samuel," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "Clara has taught me that real strength comes from being willing to face life's difficulties with honesty and grace, not from hiding behind false appearances or conventional expectations. If you can't accept her as she is, then you'll have to reject me as well, because I intend to marry this woman and spend my life with someone who has the courage to be exactly who she is." His declaration of love and commitment in front of the entire community marked the end of organized opposition to Clara's presence in Willowbrook. Samuel Fletcher might continue to disapprove of her choices, but he could no longer rally enough support to make her life impossible or to force her to leave town. Clara had won the right to remain in Willowbrook as herself, without compromise or pretense, and that victory had come not through changing others' minds, but through remaining steadfast in her own convictions until enough people came to see her worth. 6 months later, as Clara walked down the aisle of Willowbrook's church wearing a black dress, adorned with white lace and carrying wildflowers from the prairie, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of joy and triumph. She had found not just love, but a community that had learned to value authenticity over conformity, character over appearance, and the courage to be different over the safety of blending in. Her black dress no longer seemed like a barrier to acceptance, but like a symbol of the strength and honesty that had ultimately won her the respect and love of people who had learned to see past surface appearances to the heart beneath. As she and Tom exchanged vows in front of the same congregation that had once questioned her right to belong among them, Clara knew that she had found something rarer and more precious than simple acceptance. She had found a place where she could be fully herself, and a man who loved her, not despite her unconventional choices, but because of the character and conviction those choices revealed. The woman in black had become a beloved member of the community, proving that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the courage to remain true to oneself, even when the whole world seems to be asking for something different. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.